All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to the last session in our Getting Grant Ready webinar series for tribes, Developing a Budget and Budget Narrative. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or if you need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or your utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. I'm happy to introduce the series speaker, Cynthia Naha. Cynthia is a senior associate at the Capacity Collaborative and works with the American Indian Higher Education Consortium, as well as serving as the Senior Tribal Climate Resilience Liaison at the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Welcome back, Cynthia, and I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Kristen. I do appreciate that. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Let me get ready for my presentation. Let me know if you can see this, Kristen. Hold on one second. I think it's 2. Are you able to see that?
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I do apologize, I'm running kind of late today, and so just barely logged on. So, but as Kristen mentioned, my name is Cynthia Naha. I'm here today to give you the last session within the 6-part series of the Tribal Grants webinar. And I am a member of the Hopi tribe. I'm also Tewa and Ihangtawan Dakota Yate. I have 20 years of experience working in tribal government, and that pretty much runs the gamut of environmental natural resources. And more particular, within those 20 years of working in environmental natural resources, I've actually have about 20 years of grant management as well, and that includes, as we went through this series, if you were a part of the beginning, that also includes, from session 1 to today in regards to developing a budget and budget narrative. So I have quite an extensive background in the work that I've been able to do with tribes, particularly environmental and natural resources management. As most of you know, if you were a part of this series, I do understand this is for small systems. However, because of my experience, I've been using the solid waste recycling infrastructure grant to use as the example, because I have a lot of experience in solid waste management for tribes. That includes building transfer stations and recycling centers. So because we're looking at requests for proposals or requests for applications and notice of funding opportunities, I've used the Swiffer grant as an example, again, because it's where most of my expertise is at. And so just to give you guys kind of like that as an example as we move forward with today's presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, there are a lot of questions and a lot of information, and if you have any questions, please be sure to add them to the Q&A dialog box here in GoToWebinar, as Kristen mentioned. And at the end of this session, we will go ahead and answer those questions if you should have any. And I will also provide my email for the Capacity Collaborative. If you should have any questions outside of the webinar, you could definitely feel free to email me. And as mentioned, I also work for the American Indian Higher Education Consortium and the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center as their Senior Tribal Climate Resilience Liaison for the Southwest region, which is California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. So if there should be any questions those of you that are participants in the Southwest region that might have regarding climate adaptations, especially when it comes to your small systems, please feel free to reach out to me as well, and I'll provide that email, and I can provide some assistance as far as research and tools for you that may be assistance for your efforts. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So as we went through this session, the series, first we talked about identifying funding needs and finding those opportunities for those needs within your tribe or your community. It's important to really understand what those needs are as far as your project is concerned, because again, the right funding opportunity is going to be what you're going to want to look for and do research for. And again, to understand what your needs are as you look for these different types of funding is very important, because again, you don't want to look for something that's, for your small systems that might be directed toward maybe like what I'm talking about today, solid waste. We also talked about, cracking the code and navigating through RFAs, NOFOs, and federal forms. A lot of this information and all the information we went over in this 6-part series is very important to your project proposal, and most importantly, to the submittal of your proposal for whichever funding opportunity you may be applying for by whichever federal agency. We also talked about crafting a powerful logic model for project success. Again, those include your inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes, and how you really look at your project within your proposal to really identify, not only your outputs and inputs, but also looking at those short-term, long-term, and intermediate goals. So I think it's really important when we look at a lot of this information and not just the budget and budget narrative, that you kind of like do a full circle and go back to the session 1, session 2, session 3, and even session 4 when it comes to strengthening your proposal with the right data. I know for those of you that might have attended, it's really important to ensure that the information that you're putting into your project proposal is really factual, and that it's validated, and that you have the information you need to really identify, whether it's looking at, perhaps like I mentioned in the previous webinars, so you're going to do an illegal dump cleanup and you identified 6 out of 20 illegal dumps that you want to clean up, but you also know that once you submit your project proposal for those 6, you're still going to have those other 14 to clean up. So again, really just understanding, going back to your community and finding those, understanding the needs and identify them. It's also looking at where you collect that data. Now I know for most probably communities outside of tribal nations, that's going to come from places like the Census Bureau, maybe US EPA. But when it comes, and the same thing for any community, when it comes to identifying that data, oftentimes it's the data within inside our tribal reservation or a community in which we're going to look for to be able to include that information into our project proposals. Last week's presentation or session was on milestones, metrics, and measurements. And again, it's just important to really understand, how all of this ties into the overall project, but also looking at how you're going to ensure that you're achieving project success. Milestones are definitely those that track the project within the year. Metrics is identifying that the data that could eventually come out of your project. And then again, looking at the measurements of identifying what the impact is of your project proposal within your community or to your community. And so today, as we round out this series, looking at a budget and budget narrative, and I mentioned this in the first 5 as well, as we started talking about different opportunities to apply for and why it's important to ensure that as you're collecting or going through the first 5 parts of this series, it's really important that what you identify as far as those project needs will also be something that you put within your budget. Looking at what your resources are, like, you're going to hire staff, are you going to purchase equipment, is there any other types of supplies that you're going to be needing? So again, looking at your budget, it's very important to really have those actual numbers, because again, my experience with US EPA in particular, when it comes to having a budget, you're just not so to speak, putting a ballpark figure together within your budget and then submitting it that way. You really have to be specific in the information that you include in your budget, because all of that information is going to be detailed in the budget narrative. So again, remember, as I mentioned, it's not just having a ballpark number, but it's also ensuring that your budget is not a work of fiction. So even if you said, I want to purchase like maybe a recycling trailer, but you didn't do, say, your due diligence in not identifying a specific type of trailer you want for your community's needs based off of what you identified, then it's really important to ensure that you do that research so you have those actual numbers and you're not just saying, well, I need a trailer for $20,000. Again, there's other things that go into purchasing a recycling trailer, which would also include like the shipping costs to get here, if there's any taxes, certain things like that. So again, you want to make sure that your budget is factual and that it's not a work of fiction. All right, so again, looking at, if you're familiar with federal agency funding, yes, it can be very meticulous because, like I mentioned, my experience with US EPA and even one of our state grants here, the New Mexico Recycling and Illegal Dumping Alliance grant, you really have to be specific, again, in the information you're going to put in your budget. Like when I applied for the RAID grant, one of the RAID coordinators would always say it's not apples to oranges, or it's not apples to pineapples or whatever. It's always oranges to oranges, apples to apples, meaning that you have to be direct and specific. So if you're looking for, say, one recycling trailer and recycling bins, you have to really ensure that when you go to look for, or you get your 3 quotes, and your quotes are going to be based off of your own procurement policy within your tribe, depending on the budget you're looking for or the cost of that item. So again, my colleague would always tell us, it's oranges to oranges. So if you're looking for a set of recycling bins that are specific to meet your community's need, and you find one vendor, well, you better find another vendor that has the same item, very similar in context, to be able to put into that budget. Because again, it's ensuring that the items that you're seeking to purchase within from each of these vendors, or could be a potential vendor, it's important to ensure that the cost is like similar, or maybe you're saving cost and finding something cheaper. But again, just making sure you do your homework and you do your research in identifying those specific things that you need for your budget. Because again, you want to be as specific as possible, not just with the item itself, but with the number or the cost that's associated with that item. So again, and also making sure that understanding the ceiling limit for your project proposal that you're submitting for, whether it's, again, US EPA, or maybe it's, a local grant or something like that. But just making sure that, as you're identifying those costs, you are certain that what you are putting down is going to be the actual cost of what that item will be. Again, looking at why budgets are important. Again, for the opportunities that you're applying for, whether it's an RFA or NOFO or any other opportunity that you might identify that might be needed for your community, the budget is very important. Because again, if you're applying for a grant for, say, maybe it's a mini grant for $20,000 and allows you to do like something small, maybe it's like doing some outreach or something like that, because I know outreach is very important when it comes to a lot of the work and efforts we do within our tribal communities, that identifying different opportunities and how they're going to benefit you, your project proposal, and your community is very important. Because again, the budgets will serve as proof your tribe has considered the true cost of running your program. So again, that's why I mentioned it's very important to do that research, to identify any equipment needs, to identify any staffing needs, and again, to just really look at the opportunity from that perspective of what is it going to cost me to be able to purchase some recycling trailers, or to be able to hire staff, or even travel. Because we did mention in the past sessions that training is also imperative to the work that we do. So again, if you've identified maybe 3 different types of wastewater trainings that you want your staff to do, or solid waste trainings that you want your staff to do, it's very important not just to identify, of course, what staff is going, or what training that they're going to attend, but it's also important to understand where the location of this training may be. Because that information, the location, any type of travel, whether that's airfare, whether that's driving a tribal vehicle or maybe their own vehicle, per diem, all of that's very important to ensuring that the information for travel is of true cost. Because again, you're going to want to lay it all out there in your budget narrative But again, most importantly, depending on the budget ceiling amount, you're going to want to make sure that, you're not overreaching or putting in too much funding for your travel, or that, what you're looking at as far as travel plus equipment plus staff, plus maybe other items that you're looking to purchase, that they're all matching up to that overall ceiling cost of, say, $20,000, depending on what project funding you're going to look for. So again, just keeping in mind the ceiling amount that you're applying for and breaking that down accordingly based off of what is listed in the RFA or even in the NOFO. That tells you perhaps maybe there's a limit on how much you can spend for travel, or perhaps there's a limit on how much equipment can be spent on, like $5,000. And knowing that you have to stay in that realm of $5,000 without going over it to identify what type of equipment you need. So again, going back to the first two sessions where we talked about identifying funding needs and finding opportunities, and even navigating RFAs and NOFOs, because as I mentioned in the past 5, it's very important to ensure that you read thoroughly through whether it's an RFA or NOFO, because of the fact that you're going to want to follow what those allowable costs are. You're going to want to follow what those allowable activities are. So within your funding opportunity that you've identified for your tribe may not allow for travel, but you didn't know that because maybe you didn't peruse or read through it thoroughly. So again, then you're adding travel, and then that could actually be a ding on your final project proposal when it's reviewed by the grant funder. So again, just keep it in mind that budgets are very important. Same thing for the budget narrative, because they are the true costs of running your program or your project. So again, looking at it from this other perspective, but budgets also, again, summarizing the estimated cost for an upcoming project. Again, like I mentioned, doing a legal dump site cleanup, knowing that you have 6 out of 20 that you want to clean up. Well, what is really needed to do those cleanups? Are you going to need like a front loader or a back loader? Are you going to need a trailer to haul some of the refuse down to the landfill? And then even with hauling stuff down to the landfill, you're going to need, gas for both the round trip. You might also need tipping fees. Might also need PPE, since you're going to have staff out there that are going to clean up the dump site, and you want to make sure that they're protected. So again, really looking at those costs and summarizing the estimates for them, and if you can, and when you can, being most specific for that true cost. They also help in breaking down the cost elements associated to your project, looking at what is really needed for you to not only carry forward the grant, but also to be able to build capacity, as well as, understanding what is really needed for you to be successful, not just in your project, but again, looking at those short-term, intermediate, and long-term goals, being able to ensure that, through your process of logic modeling, that you're identifying, different types of cost elements that will go with your project that you're submitting for today, or your proposal that you're going to submit. But eventually, over time, you're also going to look at building that capacity. Like, say, you're going to purchase a recycling trailer, and then 5 years from now, you want, like, five years from now, based off of the need, or based off of the increase in, population, or maybe increase in homes, housing within your community, that you're understanding that, what you projected first in year 1 with the one trailer, was good enough at that point in time. But 5 years later, now you're seeing an increase in recyclables, or you're seeing an increase in the amount of refuse coming into your transfer station, or even, again, as mentioned, when your housing department's adding on, say, 20 new homes within a subdivision. So again, looking at what is going to be needed for your project, and identifying just those cost elements that are going to go forward, but also knowing that at the end of year 5, you are able to increase your equipment or your supplies or even staff. So again, it's very important, again, to understand what items you need to purchase, or you're going to put into your budget, that are going to be not just most cost effective, but are also going to help you, build that long-term capacity for your community, and how you foresee yourself moving forward into the future. Again, when it comes to, budgets and stuff and being accountable, it also shows that stakeholders, that there's the benefits or drawbacks of getting involved. So again, I know oftentimes we do community outreach. You go out and have a booth at your environmental fair, or even presenting your project success to your tribal council, because of course leadership always wants to see the efforts that we are taking to not just build capacity, but really to make that impact within our community, and knowing that appropriately spending the funding within our budgets, is key to really ensuring that grant management, and not just the grant management for the staff that's managing it, but again, looking at it through that lens of, as a tribe as a whole, because it's important that the tribe is reflected in a positive way when it comes to grant management, when it comes to drawdowns, when it comes to, again, making that impact up for your community based off of what you mentioned in your project proposal, which again will tie into your budget and your budget narrative. So again, looking back at the past 5 sessions, when you really think about it from session 1 to 6, it's kind of looking at it in a circle, with those arrows that go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because all this information that has been presented in this series is really integral to the development of your project proposal and really understanding how grant management works. So again, going back to the logic model, we talked about resources, activities, and outputs, and then looking in what you invest in, what you do, and what you produce or deliver. So again, we know we got time, we know we got partners, equipment, you got plans, education, cleanup, or again, whatever it might be doing as far as those activities you identified within your project, and then going over to what you will produce or deliver, if it's workshops or events, or even just, opportunities to provide more education out to your tribal members so that they understand what it is your department is trying to do as far as getting people to be mindful or people to participate in your efforts. So again, just really looking at how your budget could reflect the cost of your necessary input, resources, and proposed outputs. And like I mentioned, with resources, what you invest in, it's maybe identifying 2 or 3 different staff. Maybe when we talked about, I believe it was the logic model, I think it was the logic model, we talked about, perhaps within your grant, you want to hire a solid waste technician or a wastewater technician. And so knowing that that's a resource and it's vital to your efforts to build capacity for not just your department, but what you're proposing, that's important that you identify, well, is it going to be a full-time employee? Is it going to be a part-time employee? Or are you looking at perhaps maybe just hiring contractors? So again, you want to make sure that you know what it is you're going to invest in, what it is you're going to identify as those project needs, and most importantly, how it's going to fit within that budget, and back to the amount of the award of budget that you're allowed to apply for, making sure that, whether it's a full-time or part-time employee, that you are carving out enough time, so to speak, or enough hours or percentages, depending on how you look at it, that is going to, one, either meet the amount required for that particular proposal, or it's going to give you enough opportunity where you're able to hire somebody full-time, but at the same time, having enough stuff or enough funding left over to purchase equipment, maybe to plan for a workshop or to plan for an environmental fair, where if you're planning for an event within your community, perhaps you also know that maybe your grant allows you to purchase incentives, so maybe you're trying to purchase some handbags to give out at your event. So again, making sure that you really understand not just what is needed to develop these proposals or develop these budgets, but also knowing that what it is you plan on providing to your audience that's going to eventually have that short-term, intermediate, or long-term outcome. So again, looking back at it, as I mentioned, for the example that I'm using today, it's based off of my experience within solid waste management. So knowing that in the years that I've been doing tribal solid waste and understanding grants, especially when it comes to budgets and putting together your narrative, it's really looking at, again, what those resources are that's needed, what are the activities you're going to do. So again, budgets help to manage the grant funding by looking at what those resources and clearly defining the roles. It's also a way to create documentation for tracking grants. And if you've done grant management or you're new to grant management, you're going to, on a quarterly basis, depending on your reporting for that federal agency, you're also going to want to ensure that you're working with your finance department, because you're going to have to ensure drawdowns are being done based off of each quarter that you're spending the money within, that you're allocated through your award, that you're working with them to ensure that drawdowns are being happen. And based off of those drawdowns, it really helps if you're managing in an appropriate way where you know you're spending, say, $20,000, $5,000 for maybe a recycling trailer out of that $20,000. So knowing that if you completed that task of purchasing the recycling trailer, then you have about $15,000. And to me, it's really helpful when it comes to quarterly reporting, not just the narrative side, but that financial side, because reading those the statements of revenue, that what's been spent and what still remains, helps go a long way, because it gives you the idea as you continue to move through your project proposal, and especially if it's based off of a year, then you know what you have left, or you're anticipating what you have left for the remaining of the year to be able to identify the rest of those items you might need to purchase. Again, I also think it's good to follow, because it can provide a comprehensive schedule for your grant. And I know when we talked about milestones, metrics, and measurements, and that's kind of like the same thing with milestones. When I had it laid out in that table format of hiring a solid waste technician, I think there's a couple other things that I mentioned in there. But again, looking at it through that perspective, because based off of that quarter, you can also put into that table format the amount of funding that you have to spend per quarter. So that in a way kind of shows you what you need to know as far as how much money you have left to spend associated with that particular task or item that you are looking at completing within a quarter or within the end of the year. Once it comes to the end of the year, making sure that not only have you completed all your tasks, but you spent all your money. It's also a way to understand how you record the grant funds as well. So it's important to learn proper grant management when it comes to budgets, because again, you don't want to identify in your budget that you're going to purchase a recycling trailer for, say, $5,000, but you end up finding one that costs, like for example here from National Recycling Trailers, you end up finding one for $9,800, but in your budget you put $5,000. So again, there's a little bit of nuances there, because there's an opportunity for you to possibly purchase that trailer at $9,000, given that different grants will allow you to shift a 10% of your grant funds into a different I guess budget category. But again, it depends on your grant funder and the agency that you're applying for. But again, making sure you do your due diligence, because if you put $5,000 for a trailer, but everything you're coming across is more than $5,000, and you want to make sure that you have the ability to still purchase your trailer through these grant funds, or if not, identifying how you can leverage that extra $4,000 to be able to purchase it. So again, just being mindful of what it is you're purchasing, how much you allocated for that purchase, and making sure you're within budget to be able to actually purchase it for your community. So looking at through the opportunity to record these different grant funds is really important, because again, you don't want to exceed your costs of what the item is that you're purchasing. And most importantly to me, what I think when it comes to budgets, especially when we're doing drawdowns and we're doing grant reporting, is that it's an opportunity for you, especially if you have to take your information to tribal council, to show them how you are proceeding with your grant opportunity. But not only that, but how successful you are as a grant manager or the staff person overseeing that grant, to identify that you know what you're doing and you're able to report successfully on the project, not just back to the federal agency when you're submitting those quarterly narrative reports or budget reports, but also if you go to tribal leadership and you have to present your information on your program to tribal leadership, and especially if it's based off of your procurement policy, if you have to go towards your tribal council to ensure that a certain item can be purchased, and it really helps to have the information just laid out straightforward in your report, so that way you can inform your tribal leadership, well, this is how much money we had for the purchase of a trailer. Unfortunately, we found one at $9,000, and maybe based off of the information in your report that you're sharing to your leadership, maybe they can help come up with that extra $4,000. So again, just really doing your due diligence, not just to identify and clearly define these roles or to begin to create that documentation for tracking, but also ensuring that as you're developing this information, that you're being mindful of how you're going to report on it, but not just to the federal agency, but also to your tribal council. And not just tribal council, but even to your community, if you're doing a community meeting and your community is curious as to know how your recycling program is doing and how the capacity is being built, and why you had to purchase, say, maybe 5 recycling trailers when maybe you could only purchase 3. So again, just the information that you're collecting out of not just the budgets or budget narratives, but your overall project and the success that you're having can really go a long way in getting that buy-in from your community, so that way your participation in whatever your project might be proposing is seeing an increase in that understanding, and also that, again, going back to milestones, metrics, and measurements, that your project is also creating that impact where you're not just purchasing bins after bins, but you're also knowing that people are using them and helping your recycling program. So it's really important to just understand how all of this works, how to really look at the past 5 sessions into today to ensure that you're well-rounded in your project proposal. So again, kind of taking a look here, perhaps your project proposal you're applying for, as it says here, is $100,000. And also keep it in mind that most project proposals or most grant funders are going to work off of 1 fiscal year. There are some opportunities where they'll work off of 2 fiscal years. But this one, for example, that I put in here is basically from October 1st to September 30th. And again, using your scope of work, it's really going to help you develop and manage your budget, because based off of that scope of work, you're identifying what those tasks are. You're identifying within what project quarter of the year that you're going to complete this by, and you're also going to put the amount of funding that is needed to implement that portion of your scope of work, and then also what those deliverables will be. So again, understanding that if you are, say, again, purchasing recycling trailers and you want to purchase them by, say, the second quarter, and you have allocated $5,000 for that trailer, and then you're able to complete that by second quarter, and then when you go to do your reporting, you're going to report that in your grant deliverable, so that way your funding agency can see that you were successful and that you were timely with the purchase. And now you're working towards not only receiving the trailer but going to implement it, because maybe the last section of your scope of work is implementing that recycling trailer within your community to begin collecting those recyclables. So looking here, managing your funding amount ward, again, this goes hand in hand, so once you develop your budget, your budget is going to be straightforward with, whatever you identified as far as your resources, staff, drawing a blank here, but well, we'll just go with staff, and the funding means for salary. Oh, fringe, salary and fringe, you're also going to include your supplies, whether that's office supplies, or maybe it's project supplies if you're doing a cleanup. You're also going to identify what resources you might need, as far as, if you want to do a plan where you're going to need, some other items for maybe community outreach, or if you're looking at travel. So again, identifying all these elements that are going to go into your budget is important, because as you associate the amount of dollar to this item, you're also going to detail that in your budget narrative, because again, EPA and other grant funders really like to see it spelled out of what it is you're going to do as far as purchasing, say, office supplies. If you're going to purchase maybe a laptop, or if you're going to purchase a printer, maybe you're going to purchase some copier paper or printer paper, you're going to want to make sure that as you identify, say, $6,000 in your budget for office supplies, that you are breaking down in detail in your budget narrative what those items are and why they're needed. So again, it really helps to do your research, understand these various items that you're going to put in your budget, because you don't want to, either sell yourself short by not giving yourself enough money, or perhaps being a little too ambitious at putting more money in one of the sections within your budget. So making sure that you're understanding what it takes exactly, and the amount of funding that's needed to implement your project. Looking at what information is required to develop a budget and budget narrative. Again, as mentioned a couple slides ago, knowing the ceiling amount for your funding award is very important, because if you're only eligible to apply for $100,000, but you're say, because maybe you didn't fail to notice that it was $100,000 only, and then you're looking at it from a different perspective, where maybe they have 4 million or something like that in funding opportunity. But again, making sure that you know that ceiling amount, because you don't want to apply for more than what that funding opportunity or that request for application is allowing you to apply for. Identifying whether it's 1 or 2 years, and this is really important, I feel, because again, if you want, say you have intentions to apply for 2 years, and then going through your project proposal, developing your budget and budget narrative, you kind of like, because I've done this before where I forgot I was going to do a 2-year grant, and then ended up creating a 1-year grant in regards to the length of my grant. So again, having to go back to the drawing board and then identifying those costs that I need to include in my proposal, extending it out to 2 years. So then that's going to, of course, change the amount of funding you're going to need for staff, might change the amount of funding you need for equipment, might change the amount of funding you need for travel. So again, making sure that you know whether your grant is 1 year or 2 year. And most of them are about 1 year, but some of them, like I mentioned, extend to 2 years. An example of that is the U.S. EPA's General Assistance Program. Tribes can now apply for 2-year grant funding versus 1 year, which again is going to change the whole dynamics of everything, because rather than applying for one year and putting in what you need as far as your scope of work for 1 year, now you're going to have to do 2. Again, being sure that you've read through the NOFO and the RFA to understand what those eligible activities are and what those allowable costs are. And I cannot express this enough because of the fact that, without reading and understanding the NOFO or RFA and knowing what eligible costs are or eligible activities are, then it makes it a bit more cumbersome, because you don't want to put in an activity and then submit your project proposal to your federal funder, and then it doesn't get awarded because you did not identify or you did not put in your project proposal an eligible activity, because that eligible activity is also going to have an allowable cost. And oftentimes, when you fail to recognize these eligible activities, again, it puts you in a position of your proposal not being awarded. It's also important that as you read that NOFO or RFA, that you understand our matching funds required. Because again, at the same time, when you're looking through your NOFO and you identified matching funds, you got to identify whether it's, an in-kind contribution or if it's just a straight cash match. And when it's a cash match, I often find it harder to apply for any funding opportunity, because working for, some of the tribes that I worked for, unfortunately, they were non-gaming tribes that didn't have a whole lot of economic development. And because of that, they, as the tribal themselves, did not have, like, say, their own tribal government funds to be able to match whatever is required of that grant. And for example, I believe it's the Water Smart program for Bureau Reclamation. I believe they have a 50% cost share match, and that's a cost share as far as cash match. So including in-kind contribution is not allowable, but wanting that hard cash match is what they're looking for. And when it comes to, when you identify if there are matching funds for this proposal or for this NOFO or RFA, does your tribe really have the funding to be able to match it? Of course, it's different when it's in-kind opportunities or in-kind match, because you could use, maybe you have your tribal vehicle and you can use that as a match. Your own computers and printer and things like that can be used as in-kind match. Even staff, if you bring in staff, they can also be used as in-kind match. So again, just understanding, what type of match they're requiring. And last but not least, don't forget your indirect cost rate. And the IDC rate is very important because, again, you're applying for $1,000 grant, and say your indirect cost rate is like maybe at 20.5%. You got to make sure that, your direct costs are, I guess, low enough or have enough of the funding left amount to include your indirect cost rate, because that's also going to be added into the overall budget. So making sure you know what your IDC rate is, and making sure your IDC rate is up to date, because that's been an issue I've experienced many times within tribes. Within the tribes that I worked for, is we had our indirect cost rate that was from the year before, and we're still waiting for to be approved by BIA and things like that in order to get a new rate. So again, while you're waiting for that new rate to come in, you can still use the old rate, but you still got to work with your project like the coordinator on the grant side to be able to ensure that that IDC rate will be acceptable. And again, just making sure that you are well aware of what that IDC cost rate is, because it can be very impactful, especially if you have a higher IDC rate. And that means that oftentimes in your direct cost is going to be lower because your IDC rate is higher. So there's a lot that goes into that. But again, making sure that you do have your rate, you do have an understanding that funds are to be matched, and again, following those eligible activities and costs, knowing if your grant is 1 to 2 years, and most importantly, knowing what that funding award ceiling amount is. So looking at the RFPs or NOFOs, oftentimes there are templates in the back of them that you could follow. There's also just an outline for what you need to know to put into your project proposal. And I know I've showed the evaluation criteria several times throughout this series, because it's important to look at that evaluation criteria to know what your project is going to be rated on and how many points are awarded. And it kind of gives you an idea as far as, making sure that you are providing the necessary information for you to be successful in being awarded that grant. And again, just making sure you read through the whole NOFO or the RFP, because oftentimes there could be that template, and it could also include information of what a budget should include as far as, salary and fringe, equipment costs, supplies, travel, training. We always had other costs associated in our GAP grant, and oftentimes within that other associated costs, I had to put in there the purchase of maybe 6 roll-off bins, 40 cubic yard roll-off bins, because within our scope of work, we had identified as a task within this 1-year grant fund that we would host a community cleanup right before the annual feast day for the tribe I worked here in New Mexico. So again, looking at what it is you need as far as identifying funding opportunities that are going to best meet your tribe's efforts in moving forward or building capacity for a certain department or a certain project, and just looking at it through that type of lens, and knowing that it's important to understand. Reading the RFP and NOFO is very important. Again, to be sure to list the amount of EPA funding you're requesting. So within the project proposal, of course, you're always going to want to identify what that funding amount is that you are looking for, and making sure that, again, it's going to be the appropriate amount to the need you have identified for your project or for your tribe as far as building that capacity. So looking at what the opportunity provides as far as, maybe you don't need the full maximum amount. Maybe that $100,000 that's listed as the ceiling amount isn't quite what you need, although you should always apply for that full amount. But perhaps, there's a minimum amount that is eligible to apply for, say like $50,000, half of that, and maybe your project isn't as big as you thought it was, so maybe $50,000 would work instead of $1,000. So really understanding what those minimum and maximum amounts are is important, because it's going to go along with what you've identified as far as those needs for your community. And again, building that capacity is always needed, so understanding how to navigate through a lot of these RFAs and NOFOs really goes a long way, because there's so many opportunities that are out there, and how do we know what really will fit the needs of our community? But what are those specific needs that you've identified, and how do those specific needs match to these opportunities of funding, so that way you're an eligible entity, but also that that what you're proposing is an allowable cost. Itemized budgets, looking at personnel, because this is very important when it comes not just to your budget but to your budget narrative. So you've identified your personnel or your staff. You've also identified the fringe benefits that go with that, and based off of what your tribe has for those fringe benefits is important, again, because I've always worked within a 30% range of fringe benefits, and making sure that breaks down to FICA, workman's comp, health benefits, and different things like that follow under fringe. So identifying what is all included in fringe benefits really goes a long way, because it helps you understand, as you're identifying personnel at a certain cost, that what those fringe benefits are going to be, because it's also going to come out as that percentage and be included in your budget. Travel, I think travel is very important when it's indicated or identified as a need. within our grant opportunities, because again, if you're doing an in-state travel, that's going to be less cost than an out-of-state travel. And if you're doing an out-of-state travel, making sure that, if your training opportunity, say, is in, you live in New Mexico and your training opportunities in San Francisco. Well, you know that because San Francisco is an expensive city to go to, that you're going to want to make sure that, when it comes to the hotel, you have enough funding to cover the hotel. When it comes to your airfare, you have enough funding there to be able to fly round trip. Or maybe it's 2 people that are going to a training or a workshop or a conference. So you want to make sure that you're inclusive of 2 people versus 1. So really understanding what it's going to take you as the grant writer or the staff putting together your proposal, what it's going to take for you to be able to send staff to training if it's an out-of-state location. Again, looking at per diem, looking at parking costs, and just all those things that might be associated with making this travel trip to San Francisco to be able to train on a certain area that you want to learn to increase your expertise. Equipment, again, making sure that you're putting in the appropriate costs for maybe a recycling trailer. Maybe you're looking at buying a front loader. Maybe you're looking at buying maybe some 55 gallon drums to help with your oil collection. Just depends on what it is you need for your project to be successful. And that again goes back to needs. Supplies, we always know that we're going to need office supplies, whether that's writing pens or maybe pencils or maybe a clipboard or perhaps printer paper or just anything that you might need to, again, make sure your project is able to move forward in a successful manner. And when it comes to office supplies, making sure that as you're identifying what is needed, that you're also doing your research, whether it's identifying the cost from Office Max or Staples, because when you break this down in your budget narrative, you're going to say, well, I found 2 packs of pens at $5, and so you're going to want to put 2 packs of certain types of pen, $5, going to be $10 that you're going to spend for that. So knowing what it is you're going to specifically buy and the cost with that is going to go into your budget narrative. Contractual, perhaps you're doing hiring some contractors to come in and maybe they're going to be the ones to do your cleanup. So identifying those different contractors that are able to meet the needs of your cleanup to be able to put them into your grant, but also knowing when it comes to contractual that you're going to follow your personnel or your procurement policy of your tribe, and based off of that procurement policy, it's going to give you an idea as to what you need to do, say, especially if the contract or what you're putting in for contractual might be $50,000, and based off of your procurement policy, at a range of $50,000, then your tribe may request you to seek 3 different bids from 3 different contractors to select the best and most appropriate one and what is going to meet, so to speak, those needs within your budget. So say, again, if you have a $50,000 line item for contractual and you get 3 bids, and say one of them is at 45, one's at 53, one might be at 60,000. So based off of the information submitted for these bids, you're most likely going to go for that $45,000 one because it's less than the amount that you have allocated for contractual. But based off of your tribe's procurement and how you need to move forward with it, that might actually be the best one that will meet the needs for what your project is. Like I said, there's difference in other costs. And reading the NOFO and RFA is important because identifying what those other costs might be is really going to be defined in that budget narrative. An example, I know I mentioned purchasing 40-yard cubic bins or renting 40-yard cubic bins for a community cleanup, or perhaps there's registration fees for the travel you're going to do, and the registration fees, vary, of course. So you want to make sure that, as you look for opportunities for training, that when it comes to registration fees that you're putting away, you're putting into your budget the appropriate amount. So say there's a training that costs $500 per person, so you want to make sure that you're also including that in your budget and then in your budget narrative. And then of course getting to those total direct charges, once you have the total direct charges, and knowing that when you're going to add this up, your total direct charges will be all of the items above. And then when you include your indirect cost rate, the one thing that's not going to be included, or I guess charged against the IDC, is your contractual. That one is one thing that you'll leave out when you're adding up, when you're including the IDC into the total direct charges. Contractual is not going to be one where you can charge those IDC rates too. So it's important, again, not just to understand what that rate is, but where the direct charges are coming from, but how the indirect charges work, because again, not knowing that contractual shouldn't be charged to your IDC, but charging it, again, it's going to shift your entire budget where you're going to have to go back and take another look at it. Or like I said, working with your finance department is really important, because they're also going to assist you in these different needs that might be identified. But when it comes to IDC and the IDC rate, they're going to be able to help you in understanding what should be charged against it and what shouldn't. Looking at the RFA from the Swiffer grant, where it talks about, just ensuring that, applicants are aware that if their proposal includes federal funds, that the purchase of goods and products and materials on any form might be limited, or even looking at this one where it says you have to buy America, build America. So looking in the term conditions to understanding what that means for you and how you go about doing that, because again, this is listed within the Swiffer grant or whatever funding opportunity RFA that you might be applying for, and it's a requirement that you need to do, especially if you're buying like iron or steel or something like that, where you're knowing that you need to keep it within, I guess, within within America versus being able to purchase these items for China or somewhere else at a cheaper cost. So it's important to read through the RFA to understand that any other additional requirements such as this might be needed, and then again itemizing the costs that are related to, as you see here, they have same things I showed you in the last slide, and then looking at what type of when you develop your itemized budgets, again following the instructions to ensure that you are appropriately including eligible costs, but also that as you look at developing your budget, it meets your work plan as far as the funding that you might have put into each different task, and as you put into each different task, that it's going to have a dollar amount associated with it, perhaps within that task, at that same quarter or time frame within a year, you need to purchase certain things, because again, you're the one that stated in your project proposal for award that you will complete X, Y, and Z by second quarter, by third quarter, maybe by first quarter. So you want to make sure that you're really developing it in that essence of understanding how to maneuver through your budget, not just your budget, but through your scope of work, to make sure that you're meeting the needs that you've identified for your project or for your tribe, and just following suit with what is laid out for you in the RFA or the NOFO. And that's one of the most important things I cannot stress enough is, making sure that you read through that funding opportunity. So here's an example of a budget. I do see we're kind of getting short on time. So just to give you an example of what I've laid out as far as the budget's concerned and what was needed for me to complete these tasks that I had within the project proposal within the 1 year that I had this budget set for. Going into here, this is looking at the budget narrative. It's great because you don't have to waste space on that budget narrative, but also knowing that, you have no excuse for not being specific about your budget. And I cannot stress that enough. Is just looking at what those allowable costs are, making sure that you do follow suit for what you're supposed to have listed, and personnel, being honest in the amount of staff hours, staff time, and how you're going to cover those costs for all of your staff, all of the fringe. So again, making sure that you have the appropriate hours selected for each of your staff at the rate of pay that they're going to be paid at, and ensuring that those hours or percentages all add up. So again, fringe benefits, it's important to ensure that you have fringe benefits. This is an example of what is all included in some of the fringe benefits. So just making sure that that's also important to be a part of your grant proposal, because it's always going to have a percentage that's going to be associated with it. So looking at travel, again, these are just examples of what could be included into travel, because you never know. Oftentimes, I never knew that, you can include internet access charges into your travel. So I've always had to pay for those out of pocket unless it was free travel. But again, this gives you an idea as far as what is included in your travel, and how you're going to include all of this in your budget narrative, because of the fact that each of these items are important and the costs that are associated with them need to be spelled out, so that way your funder knows and understands why you have allocated, say, $500 for one particular travel, and looking at the cost, hoping that it fits within that realm, but making sure that you do have an understanding of what could all be included in travel. Again, looking at equipment, certain grants will allow you to only purchase equipment at a certain cost. So here it says $5,000. If it's more, you might need to, get approval from your federal funder, but also knowing that you need to follow your procurement policy for your tribe. And again, same thing for good supplies, making sure that they're tangible and that they're identified specifically as far as those needs, and they're outlined within that budget narrative. Again, just some examples of it, from an example from the RFA that shows what other items could be. So maybe it's rental and lease of equipment, maybe it's photocopying outside your tribe, maybe it's looking at stipends, maybe it's looking at, rebates and other types of items that might not be included in the supplies or equipment, but is listed as an other item that you've identified that you needed to complete your project. So again, indirect cost rate, making sure that you do understand that personnel and fringe, those are all going to be charged to IDC, and understanding what your IDC rate is going to, really be a number that you're going to have to understand, because it's going to reflect your overall cost, especially if you have a ceiling award of $1,000. I do apologize. I did barely look at the time, and I see we're almost out of time. So here's like supplies, electronic devices, laptops, personnel computers, cell phones. So making sure that you do budget for these, but that also, as you're budgeting them in a line item, you're being specific as to what these costs might be within your budget narrative. Other supplies that might also be included, again, like I mentioned, copier paper, pens, markers, workbooks, different things. Again, you're the one that's going to know best as far as what those supplies are going to be needed, and then doing your due diligence and doing research to identify not just where you're going to purchase these supplies from, but the costs associated. Contractors, making sure that you do have the appropriate amount that's for them. Again, going through like Zoom, maybe you have to pay for Zoom, SurveyMonkey, a room rental, especially if you're going to host an event. Vimeo, which is like YouTube, similar to YouTube, which you have to pay for the cost for. If you're going to have, maybe during your Earth Day event, you're wanting to have a couple speakers come out, and maybe those are elders from the community, so you want to make sure that you're providing a stipend to them for their time. And of course, coffee and snacks and food is a whole nother element when it comes to federal funding, because you're technically not allowed to purchase food or anything like that under federal funds. But there's also a little caveat to that, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to go over it, so I will leave it at that. Again, going into looking at the valuation criteria to ensure that your budget is meeting that specific needs for the award, and identifying that you've listed everything that's needed within this criteria, because that's what you're going to be awarded on based off of if you fit all of these needs. Again, here's just a look at what the budget narrative looks like. I know it's a lot of information, but again, you can see to the specifics of what is needed, not just in regards to the hours, the salary, the cost, and the work year, but also how you plan the staff that's listed in there is going to carry out this project. Looking at fringe, it breaks it down in fringe as far as what's needed based off of the percentage. In the listing here, the 9,000 supplies, being real specific for what you need for office supplies as well as for outreach events and workshops. And then again, looking here at travel, looking here at other costs. So again, ensuring that what you put in your budget can be explained thoroughly within your budget narrative, and that those costs are really specific to those needs, because again, you're only limited a certain amount of money or what you're applying for in your federal fund. So you want to make sure that you are specific and that you have those actual costs that relate to those allowable ones. Here, just again, going through some information on meetings and roundtables. And then again, don't forget the federal forms. I do apologize because we are running out of time or out of time. So again, making sure that you put all that information not just into your budget and budget narrative, but you're also looking at the federal form and making sure you're including that information there. So again, it's very important that all this information is included. I do apologize that we went straight to the hour, but going back to session 1 through 5 to 6 today, keeping in mind that it's kind of like looking at it in a circle, because what you start with as far as finding those opportunities to meet the needs of your tribe will really go full circle all the way around to that budget and budget narrative. So if you should have any questions, I do know we've exceeded time. I will put my email in the chat and Kristen can share it with you. And Kristen, I will go ahead and pass it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. And don't fret about going over on time. We actually have not received any questions yet, so I think we can give everyone just a minute if they would like to throw any questions into the dialog box. But yes, in the meantime, if you wanted to go ahead and send your email over, I will share that with everyone.
Okay, I've done that, and so if anybody should have questions outside of this and would like to, speak further on maybe perhaps how to develop a budget more thoroughly, or just the information that I included into the budget, this session here today, feel free to email me and I could definitely answer your questions outside of the webinar today, but also, provide that additional assistance if needed. And I'm going to give you my other email as well, Kristen, because again, if any of the tribes in the Southwest region, which again is California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, have any questions regarding climate adaptation, and especially if it's specific to their small systems, they can feel free to email me there, and I can provide some information and resources for them to help and assist in that capacity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And I think that is a wrap to this Getting Grant Ready webinar series for tribes. So a huge thank you to you for sharing your expertise with us today and throughout this entire series. Following this webinar, each of you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today, as well as a link to the recording. We also ask that you please complete the webinar evaluation so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you at future EFC events in the new year. Thank you, Cynthia.
All right, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everybody. I appreciate this opportunity that I've been here today, as well as the previous opportunities to present this information to you. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too. Bye now.